what I'm doing here is probably the most important part of the whole thing, the whole project to me, and it's a consequence of having lived with the oral history of my grandfather's story, the legacy of my grandfather's story for about probably, well, all my entire life really, ever since I was young enough to understand English. I'm sure my father was already telling me the story about his father, and eventually throughout my youth and as a teenager, I increasingly became aware of the incredible magnanimity of my grandfather's actions and what that meant. And I think one of the most striking images for me in the legacy of his story, besides the most important fact that he saved so many thousands of lives and that he was able to rise above the authority of a dictatorship and answer to a higher authority, that he chose to disobey the orders of his government, which led to his being able to save lives. But he did that basically through a simple gesture of taking a refugee's name and putting it into a visa, and then writing his own name, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, and he had to repeat that thousands of times under extreme duress and the pressure of the fact that he knew that the Germans were going to be arriving in Bordeaux, France, very shortly. So he did that for several days, working around the clock. I don't know if anybody really knows exactly how many hours, perhaps my uncle Pedro Nuno in his oral testimony, but it was surely something like 16, 18, 20 hours a day, or at a stretch anyway. And when he had finished that, he stood up and he just collapsed unconscious for several hours before he could be revived. So that image of my grandfather sitting at his desk with pen in hand and writing these refugees' names and the visas and sending his own, that was the image that stuck with me for a good 40 years or more. It wasn't until my late 20s that I made my first visit to Portugal, and that was kind of an epiphany, really, in a way for me, I think, to actually go to the various places that had enriched my memory of what had happened. And it was really an incredible experience for me. And then I think I was reminded that I wanted to do something, but I still had no idea what that might be, because really that was 30 years ago. And it wasn't until about 8 or 9 years ago that I began to get some sense of what I might do as a project. And perhaps one of the single most important idea for me was the image of my grandfather having signed visas, and that each name that he put onto a visa in his own name, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, kind of symbolized a life for me. And so that image of that, and that he did that repeatedly in a very concentrated, short period of time, was what enabled me to eventually come to the idea that I have here in the museum, which is the 30 drawings that are 1,000 names on each drawing, and I did that over the course of 4 years, I think. Unlike the performance action work, these were done just quietly, independently, privately, on my own. And each drawing takes about 10 or 20 hours to do. But very importantly for me, working in the studio on these drawings, it really gave me, over the period of about 5 years, it gave me a lot of opportunities to actually just think constantly about how I felt about my grandfather, which is really something so deeply personal to me. I don't think it's even, I don't know if I could even begin to really relate to you how I feel about that, except that I think my drawings hopefully were some attempt to do that. The drawings are an act of reverence, I think. I think that I feel a great sense of humility. These drawings, each one has got 1,000 names. It starts with a number, and this one looks like it's in the series of 23,000, I believe. I'm not sure. But I write the numbers, and I started the very first drawing was number 1, and then that would go through 1,000 names, and Aristides de Sousa Mendes written after each individual name, and so on up until this one, for example, is 23,000. And there were two basic ways in which I would start to do the drawings, more or less generally in the center of the page, but not strictly speaking. And one way was to write in rows, parallel rows, superimposing the text over and over, and doing it sort of in blocks or like shingles that resemble or suggest the text on a page, I think. That was one way in which they were done. And then this particular one here is more of a random direction where in all directions I just start writing down the names, and there is no particular direction, and it's pretty much completely random. But at some point there is a suggestion of something to me in the image. Not always, in fact most of the time probably not. And I recognize that image, and then I have to decide, do I want to slightly elevate that or continue to write and overlay it with more layers of text that will then efface that image. If it's something that resonates for me, then I'm more likely to want to do it. In this particular case, it's a fairly neutral thing. Somewhere in there when the image was smaller, probably, it just started to suggest a triangle, which is amenable in a neutral sort of way to the overall project that I was doing. And the bell was very resonant for me as an image, because it's very important in the history of Europe. And bells came to Europe in, I think it was shortly after Marco Polo. And back then it was really a form of high technology, and bells and the technology for casting bronze proliferated throughout Europe in a relatively short period of time, to the extent to which they became ubiquitous. From Asia again, bells were joined with gunpowder, and as soon as the technology for casting was used to make cannons instead of bells, and so bells were taken out of the bell towers and they were melted down into cannons in times of war, and then in times of peace they were melted back into bells, but always with a net loss of the bells, especially the great bells of Europe. And I have an incredibly powerful and moving photograph of an image that's a place about as large as a football field, with thousands of broken bells all covering the ground, ready to be melted into cannons. The idea of suitcases came to me to join with the bread, and suitcases are an extremely potent symbol for the idea of the immigrant, and even the idea of the Holocaust itself, I think, or people who were able to flee it anyway. I'm not sure where this idea came to me, whether it was really imagined or if it was something that perhaps one of the families of visa recipients might have said, or that I read it somewhere because it's such a distant memory, but it's something that kind of informed or inspired or compelled me to work with bread, and that was this idea that some people who had been in the camps had communicated amongst themselves simply by writing messages and putting them between the slices of bread and putting the bread back together into a loaf and perhaps wrapping it in a rag or something, and being able to pass it unnoticed by the Gestapo guards in the camps, and they could communicate with each other that way. Bread is deeply important to both Catholics and Jews. My grandfather was a devout Catholic, my family was Catholic, and bread is important to both Jews and Catholics by way of religious practices, but also by way of their daily personal lives, I think. And my own father had said many times that if bread wasn't on the table, you didn't have a meal. Well, the whole legacy of my grandfather has been so present for me, and underlying the whole thing is the fact that I was 6 years old when my grandfather died, and I never knew him personally because I never went to Portugal until I was in my 20s, and he died when I was 6. So there's always, in fact, I would say increasingly, this sense of saudade, actually the Portuguese word saudade, and this desire for the fact of the unrequited desire to somehow know my grandfather. And working on this project, certainly I've mentioned the fact of remembrance of the event, but it's also with all of the other artifacts and the things that I've grown up with, photographs and stories and everything, that is equally present in my mind, is the fact of wanting to know my grandfather better, wanting to understand how he could have done such an incredible thing as he had, which really he was the first person to do it, the first person to make a significant rescue act during the war, and that means he didn't have any precedent to inspire him to do it, and yet he did something incredible. He was willing to risk all, and he did risk all, and he basically lost all except the love of his family, and he died in total obscurity. And I won't say that this project has brought closure for me or anything like that, but it's just brought me closer to the feeling of having connected with him through his legacy.